Slaves trafficked each year from Madagascar alone, not including the Comoros, to the Middle East by non-European Muslim slave traders, Swahili, Comorian, Arab, Hadrami, Omani, and Ottoman. Some historians estimate that during the 1600s, as many as 150,000 Malagasy slaves were exported from Boini in northwest Madagascar to the Muslim world, including the Red Sea coast, Jeddah, Hejaz, Mecca, Arabia, Aden, Oman, Muscat, Zanzibar, Kilwa, Lamu, Malindi, Somalia, Barawa, and possibly Sudan, Suakin, Persia, Bandar Abbas, and India, Surat. Given the unique racial composition of Madagascar, which was populated by a mix of Austronesian and Bantu settlers, the Malagasy slaves included people with Southeast Asian, African, and hybrid phenotypes. European traders participated in the lucrative slave trade between Madagascar and the Red Sea as well. In 1694, a Dutch East India Company, VOC ship, trafficked over 400 Malagasy slaves to an Arabian port on the Red Sea, presumably Jeddah, where they were sold to Arab Muslim traders to be further sold and enslaved in Mecca, Medina, Mocha, Aden, Al-Shir, and Kishan. At different times and to varying degrees, Portuguese, French, Dutch, English, and Ottoman merchants were known to have taken part in the Malagasy slave trade too. European Indian Ocean slave trade. The slave trade was taking place in the eastern Indian Ocean well before the Dutch settled there around 1600. The volume of this trade is unknown. The European slave trade in the Indian Ocean began when Portugal established Estado da India in the early 16th century. From then until the 1830s, C-200 slaves were exported annually from Mozambique. Similar figures have been estimated for slaves brought from Asia to the Philippines during the Iberian Union, 1580-1640. According to Francisco de Sousa, a Jesuit who wrote about it in 1698, Japanese. Slave girls were still owned by India-based Portuguese Lusitanian families long after the 1636 edict by Tokugawa Japan had expelled Portuguese people. The establishment of the Dutch East India Company in the early 17th century resulted in a quick increase in volume of the slave trade in the region. There were perhaps up to 500,000 slaves in various Dutch colonies during the 17th and 18th centuries in the Indian Ocean. For example, some 4,000 African slaves were used to build the Colombo Fortress in Dutch Ceylon. Bali and neighboring islands supplied regional networks with 100,000, 150,000 slaves, 1620, 1830. Indian and Chinese slave traders supplied Dutch Indonesia with perhaps 250,000 slaves during the 17th and 18th centuries. The English East India Company, EIC, was established during the same period. In 1622, one of its ships carried slaves from the Coromandel coast to Dutch East Indies. The EIC mostly traded in African slaves, but also some Asian slaves purchased from Indian, Indonesian, and Chinese slave traders. The French established colonies on the islands of Réunion and Mauritius in 1721. By 1735, some 7,200 slaves populated the Mascarene Islands, a number which had reached 133,000 in 1807. The Company of Scotland was involved in the trade between 1698 and 1707. The British captured the islands in 1810, however. Because the British had prohibited the slave trade in 1807, a system of clandestine slave trade developed to bring slaves to French planters on the islands. In all, 388,000 slaves were exported to the Mascarene Islands from 1670 until 1848. In all, European traders exported 506,730,200 slaves within the Indian Ocean between 1500 and 1850, and almost that same number were exported from the Indian Ocean to the Americas during the same period. The slave trade in the Indian Ocean was, nevertheless, very limited compared to 12,000 slaves exported across the Atlantic. Some 200,000 slaves were sent in the 19th century to European plantations in the western Indian Ocean. To cross the Indian Ocean required better organization and more resources than overland transport. Ships coming from Zanzibar made stops on Socotra or at Aden before heading to the Persian Gulf or to India. Slaves were sold as far away as India or China. A colony of Arab merchants operated in Canton. Serge Billet cites a 12th century text that said that most well-to-do families in Canton, China, had black slaves. Although Chinese slave traders bought slaves, Sengchi, i.e. the Zanj, from Arab intermediaries and stocked up directly in coastal areas of present-day Somalia, the local Somalis were not among the enslaved. These locals were referred to as Bariba and Barbaroi, Berbers, by medieval Arab and ancient Greek geographers respectively, see Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, and were no strangers to capturing, owning, and trading slaves themselves. Slaves from other parts of East Africa made up an important commodity being transported by dhows to Somalia. During the 19th century, the East African slave trade grew enormously due to demands by Arabs, Portuguese, and French. Slave traders and raiders moved throughout Eastern and Central Africa to meet this rising demand. The Bantus inhabiting Somalia are descended from Bantu groups that had settled in Southeast Africa after the initial expansion from Nigeria to Cameroon. Their peoples were later captured and sold by traders. The Bantus are ethnically, physically, and culturally distinct from Somalis, and they have remained marginalized ever since their arrival in Somalia. Origin of the Bantu slave trade. 2,500 years ago, speakers of the original Proto-Bantu language group began a millennia-long series of migrations eastward from their original homeland in the general Cameroon area of Central Africa. This Bantu expansion first introduced Bantu peoples to southern and southeastern Africa. To satisfy the demands of the market for agricultural produce in the Arabian Peninsula and cater to the local needs, Somali clans in the lower Shabelle region and along the ancient Banadir coast began the procurement of Bantu slaves from Arab slave traders to provide labor and serve as client farmers for the Somali clans. The farming was performed by local client farmers, boon, or low-status groups of the dominant Bimal, Geledle, Hintire, Murosade, Mobilane, and other predominantly pastoral clans which had established control of small portions of the valley. They are produced mainly to serve local markets. Ample fertile land remained uncultivated due to a chronic shortage of farm labor. In order to respond to market demands for grain in South Arabia, the local Somali clans of the lower Shabelle began purchasing slaves from Arab and Swahili slave ships. These slaves came first from Zanzibar, the Zegwa or Mushunguli people. The Bantus residing in Somalia are the descendants of Bantu individuals who were taken captive and transported to Somalia by Arab slave merchants during the 18th and 19th centuries to work as agricultural laborers. The Somali Bantus belong to several ethnic groups, namely Majindo, Manyasa, Makua, Mzihua, Mushunguli, and Molima, each consisting of numerous subclans. Their ancestral roots can be traced back to various historical and modern African nations, including many in Central Africa, those of the Congo region, such as the then Kingdom of Congo, modern Angola, DR Congo and Rots-Sea, Mozambique, Malawi, and Tanzania. Bantus are ethnically, physically, and culturally distinct from Somalis and Ethiopians, and they have remained marginalized ever since their arrival to the Horn of Africa. All in all, the number of Bantu inhabitants in Somalia before the Civil War is thought to have been about 80,000, 1970 estimate, with most concentrated between the Juba and Shabelle rivers in the south. Recent estimates place the figure as high as 900,000 people. However, lower estimates place the figure between 500,000 and 600,000. East African slave trade. The Indian Ocean slave trade was multi-directional and changed over time. To meet the demand for menial labor, Bantu slaves were captured from southeastern Africa and sold in cumulatively large quantities over the centuries to customers in Egypt, Arabia, Somalia, Persia, India, the Far East, and the Indian Ocean islands. From 1800 to 1890, between 25,000 and 50,000 Bantu slaves are thought to have been sold from the slave markets of Zanzibar alone to the Somali coast by Somali slave traders. Most of the slaves were from the Makua, Nyasa, Yao, Zaramo, and Zigua ethnic groups of Tanzania, Mozambique, and Malawi. Collectively, these Bantu groups are known as Mushunguli, which is a term taken from Mzigula, the Zigua tribe's word for people. The word holds multiple implied meanings, including worker, foreigner, and servant. 19th to 20th centuries. Bantu adult and children slaves, referred to as jarir by their Somali handlers, were purchased in the slave markets explicitly to do undesirable work on plantations with oversight. They were made to work in plantations exclusively owned by the Italian government along the southern Shabelle and Juba rivers, harvesting lucrative cash crops such as grain and cotton. Bantu slaves toiled under the control of the Italian government. The Bantus were conscripted to forced labor on Italian-owned plantations since the Somalis themselves were averse to what they deemed menial labor, and because the Italians viewed the Somalis as racially superior to the Bantu. Catherine Lowe Bestaman notes, while upholding the perception of Somalis as distinct from and superior to the European construct of black Africans, both British and Italian colonial administrators placed the Juba Valley population in the latter category. Colonial discourse described the Juba Valley as occupied by a distinct group of inferior races, collectively identified as the Wagosha by the British and the Wagoshia by the Italians. Colonial authorities administratively distinguished the Gosha as an inferior social category, delineating a separate Gosha political district called Goshaland and proposing a native reserve for the Gosha. Bestaman, 1999. The Italian colonial administration abolished slavery in Somalia at the turn of the 20th century. However, some Somali clans, notably the Bimal clan, opposed this idea. The Bimals fought the Italians to keep their slaves, Nilotic slaves. In the late 19th century, groups from the coastal regions of Kenya were also sold into slavery. Referred to as the Core, these Nilo-Saharan-speaking Nilotes were later emancipated by British colonial troops. They subsequently resettled on the Lamu seaboard as fishermen and cultivators. Like many Bantus, the Core reportedly now speak the Afro-Asiatic Somali language on account of their time in servitude. Other slaves. In addition to Bantu plantation slaves, Somalis sometimes enslaved peoples of Oromo pastoral backgrounds that were captured during wars and raids on settlements. However, there were marked differences in terms of the perception, capture, treatment, and duties of the Oromo slaves in comparison to Bantu slaves. On an individual basis, Oromo subjects were not viewed as racially jarir by their Somali captors. The Oromo captives also mostly consisted of young children and women, both of whom were taken into the families of their abductors. Men were usually killed during the raids. Oromo boys and girls were adopted by their Somali patrons as their own children. Prized for their beauty and viewed as legitimate sexual partners, many Oromo women became either wives or concubines of their Somali captors, while others became domestic servants. In some cases, entire Oromo clans were assimilated on a client basis into the Somali clan system. Neither captured Oromo children nor women were ever required to do plantation work, and they typically worked side by side with the Somali pastoralists. After an Oromo concubine gave birth to her Somali patron's child, she and the child were emancipated, and the Oromo concubine acquired equal status to her abductor's Somali wife. According to the Somali studies pioneer Enrico Carulli, in terms of diya, blood money, payments in the Somali customary law, zir, the life of an Oromo slave was also equal in value to that of an ordinary ethnic Somali. Freedom for Oromo slaves was obtained through manumission and was typically accompanied by presents such as a spouse and livestock. During abolition, former Oromo slaves, who generally maintained intimate relations with the Somali pastoralists, were also spared the harsh treatment reserved for the Bantu and Nilotic plantation slaves. The Italian colonial administration abolished slavery in Somalia at the turn of the 20th century. However, some Somali clans, notably the Bimal clan, opposed this idea. The Bimals fought the Italians to keep their slaves. From 1893, the Italian colonial authorities in Somalia did not recognize the legal status of slavery, and slaves were thus legally free to leave their owners. But the Italians often returned fugitive slaves to their owners if the owners belonged to clans friendly to the Italians. In 1903-1904, after pressure from humanitarians, the Italians banned the slave trade and declared that all slaves born after 1890 were legally free. When the Italian government took over the administration of Somalia in 1906, they did free slaves in urban territories via compensation, but did not act to free slaves in the interior of the country, and in fact tried to stop the wave of fugitives who left their owners as news of the Italian emancipation reached the rural interior, since it was a cause of unrest. But numerous slaves did leave their enslavers in the inland, and in any cases settled in their own villages of former slaves and client cultivators of land under clans. The Italians reported to the Advisory Committee of Experts on Slavery in the 1930s that the slavery and slave trade in Somalia had now been abolished. However, although the Italians freed some Bantus, some Bantu groups remained enslaved well into the 1930s and continued to be despised and discriminated against by large parts of Somali society. For centuries, faith was used to chain millions in slavery, and only later to set them free. The Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England have both apologized, but the scars remain. The question is, can history ever truly be healed? What do you think? Can faith ever fully atone for slavery? Comment below. The story of slavery in the churches isn't just about the past. It's about choices we make today. If this history opened your eyes, share this video, subscribe, and help uncover more truths they never taught us. The Catholic Church, the Church of England, institutions of faith, yet complicit in chains. They've spoken apologies, but words cannot erase centuries of silence. So I leave you with this. What role does faith play in justice today? History lives on, in us. From papal decrees to branded flesh, from pulpits to plantations, this is the history of faith and slavery. But this is only one chapter. The next is still being written. Subscribe for more untold history. From the shores of West Africa to the plantations across the world, millions of lives were torn apart. Slavery in Africa was more than chains and ships. It was families, cultures, and futures stolen. Today, the echoes remain, and so does the responsibility to remember. History forgotten is history repeated. If this story moved you, subscribe and join us in uncovering more untold truths. Slavery in Africa reshaped the world. Its scars are still visible in economies, cultures, and identities today. The question is, what do we do with this history now? Though millions were enslaved, Africa's spirit was never broken. The resilience, culture, and voices of her people still echo across the globe. Out of chains came courage, and out of suffering, strength. Honor the past, empower the future. Subscribe for more stories that history tried to silence. Millions taken, cultures shattered, history rewritten. Slavery in Africa isn't just the past. It's the foundation of our present. Don't let it be forgotten. Millions enslaved, legacies stolen, voices rising. Subscribe for more untold history. For centuries, millions of Africans were stolen from their homelands, stripped of family, freedom, and identity. Slavery was not just a crime against a people, it was a crime against humanity. Millions taken, millions lost, millions remembered. And yet, Africa's spirit was never broken. The strength, music, traditions, and resilience of her people survived. Today, that legacy lives on across the world, from Lagos to Kingston, from Accra to New Orleans. Slavery in Africa is not just history. It is memory. It is legacy. And it is our duty to remember, because history forgotten is history repeated. Remember, reflect, resist. If this story opened your eyes, share it, subscribe, and join us as we uncover more untold truths of our past, and how they shape our present.